Veldig hyggelig. Yes.
I'll give you a list of people.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, wonderful. Let's get started. We're gathered here today to speak about a theme that is quality versus diversity. When I was asked to start up on that theme, I was, just mildly irritated at the concept of quality being an alternative to diversity, or diversity possibly being seen as something that automatically led to quality being worse. There are some assumptions in that title which are, but I understood from my conversations with KILforsk that it was not by chance that that particular subject was raised. I'm going to present the people who are in the panel, but first I will use my power to present myself. I have a full-time job working with diversity and gender balance in research. That includes contact with universities, with colleges, and with research institutes all over Norway. I work for a committee that's appointed by the Ministry of Education. So diversity came onto the agenda way after gender balance did. And I think when you speak about diversity, the 5 years I have worked in this particular committee has taught me that every time you speak of diversity, you speak of everyone has their own conception, their own idea of what they mean. Some people immediately speak of diversity as meaning all forms of disadvantage. So when you speak about diversity, their thoughts go in the direction of diversity and inclusion, and often disadvantaged, marginalized immigrants or other minorities. But because I work in the research field, there's another diversity that also comes to mind, and that is diversity seen as internationalization and excellence. And we're talking about two different doors we want to open. One is opening the Norwegian research door to that big world out there where a lot of colleges and universities are much higher ranked than Norwegian universities. And so you're welcoming a lot of people in. There are like 25% professors who are foreign in Norway. And you're opening the door to excellence from outside. And then there's the other door. That is the door of, as I said, disadvantage, inclusion, low status. So even when you only speak of diversity, that is a mixed concept. And I haven't even mentioned, of course, we also speak of persons with disability, all the categories that today are a part of our anti-discrimination laws. The other thing I want to say is quality. Working in the field of art or working in the field of research, you use slightly different words and define them slightly differently. In research, they speak about quality and excellence every time they employ a new person. And excellence is defined in, I've at least seen three very broad definitions. One is you see it and you know it. It's like, it just is itself. It's brilliant. And even when you're talking about, chemistry, it's like, I know that researcher that's it. The second part is there's a set of criteria you have to tick off, and I just, for interest's sake for myself, I've just brought them in because it turned out they aren't that different from when music or in different art literature. They speak about someone who has a significant contribution, it's a worthy topic, it has relevance for society, it has originality, it has scientific merit, and it has resonance. And I think the resonance part is really interesting. It means it resonates with someone out there. And brilliance isn't brilliance in isolation. So I think that's kind of interesting. I've asked for a picture to be put on the screen. There it is. Both for researchers, but also for writers, there are some standards of excellence which are beyond anything else. And the Nobel Prize is one of them. So I brought out a diagram which says something about world literature the last 100 years and what has been definitely the most excellent of that. And you'll find I used to be an Indian citizen. There's one writer in 100 years, that's Rabindranath Tagore, who has received it. So basically in India, there hasn't been any excellent literature since. China has won 2 of African writers. 2 of them are South African, so they wrote in English. And there's a Egyptian and I think 1 Nigerian. I can't remember the 4th one. So the whole continent of Africa was without any significant writers for a very long time. Interestingly, Nordic, I'm sorry I'm being sarcastic, but this sort of is a bit weird. 14 Nordic writers have been at the top, absolute top of world literature. And some are they have proven themselves. But some of them were kind of obscure, if you look in the long run at some of the names. But anyhow, so our standards of excellence, our standards of quality are in high art. There is a sort of assumption that quality matters more than gender or color. I'm quoting from someone here. We do that, however, without questioning the underlying assumptions of that contention, namely that so-called quality is highly subjective, culturally specific, and that systems of institutional power will favor the work of some populations over other populations and will reinforce the norms that allow the privileges to exist. I'd sort of like to just end my own personal bit by saying I'm a big Bollywood fan, and I saw a Russian characterization of an Indian actor where it said, everyone, and then they listed up 15 countries, will acknowledge that this man is a superstar. And I can just guarantee you, if I put that man's face on the screen, the majority would not recognize it. But in the whole of a lot of the Middle East, Africa, Eastern Europe, East Asia, everybody would automatically recognize that. So we have to deal with the local, the international, something that are contextual and can't be understood outside. Quality is something that we're going to discuss. Now, I've spoken for a while, and that's quite enough. So I'm going to go over to the panel, and each of them is going to speak for a few minutes, for 4 minutes, I think, I hope. The way we'll do it, because I was in on the last session and it was pretty interactive, I would like to allow 2 panelists first to speak, and then you can ask some short questions, and then we'll go on to the next 3. And then any questions in that, if anything for clarification, not a longer discussion, if you please. And then later we can do the longer discussion because we got 90 minutes, and that's great. All right. Our panel is, it was more Nordic when we started out than it is now. We have lost a Swedish participant along the way. Let me start with Phyllis Akinyi. She's a Danish-Kenyan choreographer and a dancer with a dual base in Madrid and Copenhagen. She's also an anthropologist. Her artistic practices focus... Something happened. Her artistic practices focus on contemporary folklore and third culture kids' perspectives. She's the founder and the artistic director of Compania a Flamenco, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, a dance company that investigates the African roots of flamenco. She asked me specifically to say that there has been a mistake in the program. She's not representing the Danish Dansk Kunstnerråd, the Danish Arts Council. All right, Phyllis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi. Yes. So it's just in the folder. It says Dansk Kunstnerråd after my name, and I would just like to clarify for transparency that I am not representing them. I'm here as an individual artist, and apparently the only not Norwegian, but that's a different topic. Yeah, so I was also provoked by the title of this panel discussion, quality versus diversity. But I think it's a right provocation because it's what we meet a lot in this sector. And I I just came from another panel discussion, and I'm going to allow myself to be the angry black woman. Because it wasn't surprising. This is what we have experienced. This is the train that has run us over repeatedly for as long as we have existed on Scandinavian territory. But it is a bit disappointing to continue to hear these narratives from people in positions of power at a conference that's supposed to change this. So I made some comments during that panel discussion, being in the audience listening, and I'm sure that we will get into the whole quality, very focused discussion on quality. So I will just preach to the choir for some, hopefully open the ears and educate some others. But we need to stop thinking that we, and with we I actually should exclude myself, the majority Scandinavians, the white population Scandinavians, that they're giving handouts when they're talking about diversity and inclusion in the arts and cultural sector. There are no handouts. This is no hierarchy. Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Finnish, Icelandic, Faroe Islandic, and colonial Greenlandic culture and art is not superior to art coming from other parts of the world. So, as a lot of us know, but some apparently are oblivious to this point, it's very important for any of this to change anything, that the majority, the people in power, the white Scandis, do some self-reflection before you come to us and ask us to change things, okay? And there's a classism and an elitist thinking in these institutions, which is also based on quality, whereas you need to have the right education from the right schools that they decide to even be considered. And then on top of that, you should preferably do art within a field that they stereotype you in, the box they put you in. If you don't lead up to these criteria, then there's no funding. And I'm speaking of experience. I'm here as an artist, nothing else than that. I'm not representing an institution. I'm here as an artist who has felt this on my body, in my work, constantly. And the thing is, it's not for us. And that's why I feel like a lot of people get it wrong. Again, it's not a handout. It's not for us, because we are the future. We're not only the present, but we're also the future. So the whole cultural and artistic institution of Scandinavia will suffer if you don't change. And if you don't change yesterday. So, yeah. And we can talk later. That's my last. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you.
you. Thanks. We go on to Hilde.
Yeah.
Hilde Ghosh Maisey is the managing director of an organization called TRAP, Transcultural Arts Productions, an independent art production company which is meant to increase diversity in Norwegian arts and culture. She's worked as a photographer and founded an Institute for Applied Conceptual Art, and has chaired FFF, the National Organization for Photographers, and has also taught photography in the Bergen Academy of the Arts and in Elvebakken Upper Secondary School. She's also written a handbook of political influence that was part of the Akershus Art Center celebration of the Norwegian Constitution.
Yeah.
Hilde?
I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad that you opened the show as well, Phyllis. It's like, because this project, I followed it actually since it began in 2016. I'm sitting with a pencil that I nicked from the museum in Finland. That it was the conference room where it began, and it was like from the very outset, it had these sort of grand ambitions about making the art sectors more inclusive, but it also had these worries, this feeling of who are we to invite whom? And exactly those questions that you struggle with as well, and especially that feeling of it being a sort of a social, social samvittighet is in Norwegian, social
Conscience.
Yeah, it's like sort of that you do it for being kind. Our organization, it's it has changed its name several times. We've become increasingly difficult to understand what we're talking about. But now we just trap. We're not trying really to trap people, but still. We are transcultural arts production, and what we do is to put productions on the road and establish new and experimental ways of showing that actually exactly what you're saying, increase of diversity equals increase of quality. And we have said this for 25 years with an increase of worry that people actually don't understand what we say when we say it. But instead, but our organization has been, there's a lot of white people who've worked with STRAP, but every single one of them, though, being very enthusiastic about this artistic potential that an increased diversity will unleash in our cultural sector. And we're right, aren't we? I mean, there has been an increase in diversity, and we have seen an increase of quality. And also what you're talking about, when we talk about resonance with whom? Who are we actually talking about reaching out to? And I love that. I love the fact that we've come this far, that we are genuinely puzzled about what this means. It means, actually, although it can be painful, it can be a bit sort of it's a bit sort of it can be a bit difficult to find your footing in that kind of room. It is nonetheless a huge improvement that this room exists, and I'm really happy to be here with you. The project that we were invited, the reason I'm here is not just because I'm nicking all your water and your pencils. We run a project at TRAP called Nøkkel til byen, Keys to the City. And it's an outreach program where we reach out to kids, youngsters, and young people in communities that are underserved by our cultural sector. And we sort of matchmake them, where we make these sort of small jobs and placements where they can work for pay in cultural institutions around. We start up in Oslo, and we definitely want to travel all Norway with it. But the thing is that what we learned from that is that people from minority background do not need. The only thing they lack is opportunities. They do not lack the talent. They do not lack the interest. There is nothing there that it's sort of so all that distance between the cultural sector and its minorities is produced by just that. There's not enough distribution of opportunity to people. And it's really exciting to build a program that addresses that sort of imbalance. Have I spoken for 4 minutes already? God, yeah, I've only started. But I'll I hope to conclude later with all. But yeah, thank you for reminding me, Ella. Yeah.
All right, are there any questions or comments, clarifications you need from the two who have just spoken? From the audience? Yep.
My name is Jakub Sis, I'm a writer. You spoke about diversity, and there's a word that you just used. You said an increase.
Yeah.
Can you give any figure?
No. That was a very short answer. Sorry, a figure in terms of...
How much it's increased?
I don't... you're talking about sort of numbers in...
Well, I mean, numbers of... basically numbers of people who have been recruited, for instance. I mean, there is in this room, I do recognize a lot of teachers, dance teachers, people who are into theaters. So I just wanted to know if you can tap into this, if there's any specific numbers.
No, I feel we should pass this question on to someone with a statistical background in a way, because I'm happy to just give away the kind of numbers I have in my mind, but they wouldn't be trustworthy at all. That's not my professional background. Sorry, but what your question is that whether it's been an increased diversity or not? Is that what you?
I'm very interested because
Yeah.
there's been, I'm very pleased about this. I'm very pleased with this. Those spaces here. I mean, it's very, very, very good to have those discussion and those conversation. But I think you use in your introduction
Yeah.
the word increase. So I was very interested in knowing if you had any numbers, because you said there's been an increase.
Yeah, that's just my very subjective experience. So it's not a very intelligent point, I'm realizing. But I mean, but the thing is that, it's just that I meet more of what I call my people, my network of people. I meet them now more in positions around in the cultural sector than I used to.
Okay, thank you, Jakob. Thomas?
Just because I know it from this project, KILforsk in Sweden did a study for this project. Inclusion in the cultural arts field in the Nordics is approximately 14 to 15%. If you control that for Africa and Asia, meaning visible minorities and black people and minority ethnic, it's around 3%. And there's no substantial evidence anywhere that says that there has been any increase, just so that is said. In Norway, for example, we have less schooled black bodies on stage in Arts Council funded productions today than we had in the 90s, if we just do the numbers. So we have no substantial evidence that there is an increase, and it's a little bit dangerous that we keep saying so without knowing. And it's not a criticism. Because we say it a lot, and we always say the society is moving forward. And it's a little bit like saying, let's say if you do a business as an example, and you ask the men, what is your attitude towards the women? And then you say, ooh, that's kind of bad. And then you say, this is what you should say, and then you ask the men again. But at no point did you ask the woman, is your butt touched more now or less now than before? So you actually don't know because you haven't asked the people who are affected, and we still haven't asked the people who are affected.
So, I mean, I just want to add to that we do report in from very different corners of the cultural sector. And in my little planet, on my little island, I have seen an increase of diversity. But this is why it is a question for researchers who does statistics, really. And I agree that it's an important thing to do.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on that. I have specifically worked on that with the research field, and it's a very difficult. It was a very difficult project, and we managed to get the numbers, and the numbers were very different from what people perceived, and that was partly because, but that's in the research field. Everyone thought there was a great diversity because there were a lot of foreign employees, but it turned out a lot of them were going through, and very few of them were non-Western. So getting the numbers is actually a very useful exercise. And in fact, Cisse was one of the people who got me onto this 11 years ago when he asked me, how many African professors are there in Norway? And nobody had the numbers, had to start looking them up by going to all the universities and looking up and asking questions, and nobody knew. Sorry, your turn.
No, I would just like to add that it's very disappointing. I know that I'm also sitting here, but to see so many non-BIPOCs talk on behalf of us. And I just feel like we keep wasting money on doing these project-based investigations, temporary solutions, and still have the same people talk about us without being us. And to add to that, just because I might not be able to talk later, I just want to get this in. Putting people of ethnic diversity into positions does not mean that the only thing we can focus on is being diverse. We are highly intelligent, highly capable individuals, professionals, who can manage any job just like the rest. But we can add something to it. We can add something to the blind spots that are so clearly still here after 25 to 30 years of talking about it. So can we stop spending so much money on having the same people having the men investigate the women's butts touching, and just spread out the resources a bit more and let us do our jobs, and then things will change. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. I'll move on to Meena Rathore, who is a director and a screenwriter who has attended film school in Columbia University in New York and earned a Master of Fine Arts in directing. She's directed and produced commercials, commissioned films, and short films and music videos. She's written many of the commissioned films she's directed, and she has written a film that is presently available on the Norwegian National Broadcasting site. The film is called Nora, a novella film available on NRK. A lot of her work combines strong visuals with a probing story where stereotypes are often switched around. Meena, you were going to speak about the stories that you're allowed to tell?
Yeah, so I'll be speaking mostly from the film art point of view because I don't know much about the other art sections and diversity. But I think that in a discussion like this, we do need to question what do we define as diversity. And in the film world in Norway, that is defined by the stories that we tell. And the stories that have diversity are typically about gangsters, forced marriage, and bad culture. And diversity should mirror the society we live in. And I question, do we really live in a society where all colored people are poor gangsters with evil parents that are trying to marry them off in forced marriages? We don't. And I think that in 2019, soon 2020, when Norwegian producers make films that are set in Oslo as The Quake, the Norwegian name is Skjelvet, that film should show Oslo the way it is. But it was a very, very white film. Another example is a Norwegian TV series called Heimebane. I attended a conference at the Norwegian Film Institute where the producer for this show was, and he had an interesting story because he said that when they were making it, NRK, the Norwegian National Broadcasting TV channel, told him that you have to include 20% diversity amongst the actors. This is a show about Norwegian football. The poor guy went home and was frustrated. He was like, how am I going to manage to do this? Until he realized, oh, it's Norwegian football. It's not white. That shouldn't be difficult at all. So this just shows that it's not really that the stories aren't there. It isn't really that the talent isn't there because he found all the actors. And there's nothing wrong with him either, the poor guy. He just didn't know how to think outside his white box because he only has white friends. Another thing that came up today when we were sitting upstairs in another panel, it strikes me that a lot of Norwegians, when we mention the word diversity, tend to think of refugees who can't speak Norwegian. And does our diversity view come from reality, or does it come from the newspapers, and how much does this color us? I was hired to do some films for IMDi. How should I say that in
Norwegian
Norwegian?
Directorate of Integration. Is it? Yeah, integration, not immigrants.
Yeah, integration. And they hired a white researcher to work with Norwegian bosses about the issues they had with ethnic people at their workplace. You'd think it would be the other way around. So one of the cases she had found was about people talking their own language in the workplace. Okay, fine. So I made the film. I cast 3 really good-looking, very young French guys, white, speaking French. when she saw it, she had a fit. She's like, but this isn't the film you were supposed to be. Like, they should be Somalis. And I was like, why? You said it was the language. That was an issue. And I think that that is a very good example where diversity actually brings quality, because if a white person had made that film, they would have made it with the Somalis, and it wouldn't have been about the language, it would have been about the skin color. I would also like to mention my novella film, Nora, because I think diversity should also be about the stories I, as a non-white person, am allowed to tell. I made a short film inspired by Ibsen's play, The Dollhouse, set in 2019, that challenges how liberated are Norwegian women, what expectations does a Norwegian couple have from Norwegian society in living a successful life as a married couple, and they end up going to India to explore surrogacy. I also wanted to show an India that we don't really see on TV, the India that I see, you know, not the slums and all of that. It's actually quite good economy to do films like that, because we got huge discounts in India at all the production houses, because they were very happy that a Western film wasn't going to have any cows or slums in their movie. However, when I came back to Norway with the finished film, I had white colleagues asking me, but why didn't you film more of the real India? I was like, I shot it in India. This is the real India. So it's now like, you know, like when we add diversity, when I'm allowed to tell these stories, we do kind of, you know, move away from the stereotypes. And I would like to end with saying that diversity sells. Black Panther was made for $200 million. Box office was $1.3 billion.
Yeah.
Yay. Okay, I'd like to introduce the next speaker with a little praise to start off with, because his name is not on this list. He is Bol Christensen Scheel, but it turns out he's not. He's Anders Rønningen, and he agreed to participate on the shortest of notice. So thank you, Anders, that was great. He's an associate professor at, I don't know what USN is called in English, the University of South-East Norway?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Faculty of Humanities, and he has a music education and a music education, double music, and he works a lot with diversity perspectives and with the culture school, is it called the culture school? I have your text in Norwegian, unfortunately. Kulturskolen, the culture school, yeah, as an area. And the reason he stepped in for Bol is he has also been active in a project, a Nordic project regarding research on the effect of the cultural schools. You can tell more about it when you speak. Anyhow, but he has worked with community arts, arts education, community music, and how to involve minorities in the music schools. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I'm representing, I don't know which hat I actually wear. I suppose lots of us have different hats. Mine is the one from the University of South-East Norway, and also from the Norwegian Council for Schools of Music and Performing Arts, kulturradet, that is. So I've been involved in the network, one of the networks related to this conference, which is a network for the kulturskole. I use the term kulturskole because I think everybody would understand that. It's kultur and skole, and it's not the cultural school, which has other associations, I think. So I've been involved in that network, consisting of 3 different municipalities from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. It's called KIL, or Kulturskolen som inkluderende kraft I lokalsamfunnet, or Kulturskolen as an inclusive force in the local community, probably could be translated to. I'm also leading the KILforsk, which is kind of a researching network associated with that project, which consists of 25 researchers from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and that addresses relevant issues according about kulturskole and about inclusion and diversity and so on and so forth. We'll be publishing an anthology next year, bringing out some other different perspectives that has to do with those things. So I would like to address more directly into the question of quality versus diversity. And of course, to me, it's also a mistake by category, because those two words aren't supposed to be on the same level. I will try to explain that. This is my opinion, though. Some people would say and would claim that diversity will be on the cost of quality. And it's reasonable to claim that. It might be true in some cases, right? For example, the slogan of the kulturskolerådet, the kulturskole field in Norway, is kulturskole for alle. Kulturskole for all. And we can ask, is it possible to include everybody and still maintain quality? It might be a better platform for recruition, probably. But at some point, kulturskolen for alle, for everybody, isn't possible, because art it is about excellence, and if it's for everybody, then it's everyday experience. It's probably not art. I don't know. There's something there that we have to agree on. It is true. Complete diversity or complete inclusion and quality is probably not going together always. Some also say, which is equally true, I believe, that diversity is a sign of quality. It is, per definition, it is of bad quality if we don't have the diversity. It might be true as well. Some also say that having a staff, for example, in an organization which are more diverse will actually help the organization in their deliverance, whatever it is. It might be true as well. My argument is that none of these perspectives are especially meaningful unless we first define quality. That is my main point. We have to define diversity, yes. We also have to define quality. And speaking about artistic quality, we have to define that as well. So I think we need to take a step backwards. In our sector, the kulturskole sector, artistic quality is just one of the qualities that we need to address, that we need to discuss, that we need to define. I would actually range it far below other qualities that for me are more important in a kulturskole. For example, pedagogical quality, representational quality, institutional quality. And we need to come to terms, we need to define all this to be able to say, how does diversity relate to quality? Because quality is never an objective figure. Quality is always contextual. So to render quality as an objective matter is when it really becomes dangerous. We have to acknowledge that to say that this or that is of high or low quality is simultaneously to rely on hidden criteria that are closely linked to power structures. So quality is a term that hides power structures. So we need to define it and we need to discuss it more openly. So we should try to open that black box, or whatever you like to call it. I'm using Bruno Latour language and calling it a black box of quality. We speak about it as if we're referring to the same thing, but actually what's inside the black box is very different from. And it's a lot of power mechanisms locked into that black box. So every time we are referring to it without discussing what is inside, we are making those power relations even more strong than they were before. Whatever we think about quality and diversity, I think we're all doing it. We're forgetting that quality is a black box containing power structures. So just my final conclusion for the kulturskole, which is my field, I think that it's very important. It's one important task to define what is good artistic quality, but it's also important to define what is quality for us. What is the qualities of our society and our communities? We should discuss that first. That would be my speech.
Thank you. That was interesting. There's a lot of power in there. That is very suitable for a transition to Thomas. He's all about power.
What an introduction.
Yeah, okay. I have a history. Thomas was in African Youth when I met him, and he was quite young, and he was expressing the need for more visibility and more power, and that's something I associate with you. But that was not what it said on my nice slip of paper. I will go back to the official version. Thomas, I know him as well as someone I've seen dance on a number of occasions, and he's really good. So that's one thing. Also, sorry, still not on the manuscript. Artistic director and the founder of Tabanka Dance Ensemble, Northern Europe's only full-time black dance company. The founder of the Talawa technique, a fully codified and examinable dance technique taught at institutions for higher learning. Head of Critical Friends, a group of specialist consultants to the project that has culminated in this conference, sits on 6 boards in the Norwegian art sector and is concerned with diversity as a measure of quality. Thomas, there was going to be a film. The technician, is there a film? Ah, there it is. Yes. Please, the floor is yours. The film is running.
Good. So yes, you put me off, or now I lost everything. No, I'm also the head of the Critical Friends group that you've heard mentioned a lot of times during this conference. And to speak directly to quality and also what Phyllis mentioned before, the first 3 sessions that you were on before this were curated by the Intercultural Network. The second 3 sessions, which are these 3, were curated by the Critical Friends. Some of the criteria we set that it would not be a single POC alone in any panel, for example. And the reason why is because we knew that these conversations will reveal the lack of quality when it comes to the competence on diversity within the field, because it's something that we meet every day. And I think I'll scrap everything I was about to say to kind of go along those lines and talk about quality. That's why I gave the video, so the dancing and what I do is there, so I don't need to talk about that and do this self-presentation thing. But to contextualize, Obama is not a measure of how far the African American has come. Obama is a measure of how far white America has come. And there's that difference. Zab Mabungu, a fantastic choreographer, Congolese based in Canada, says diversity is not something we do, it's something we acknowledge. It's already there. And I think those are 2 important things to mention. And I will say something that might be shocking to someone, but quality does go down with diversity. It does. I'm going to put it on the table. And the reason why is because the institutions do not know how to do it. So if you are a diverse company and you enter the institution, the quality of everything that the institution is supposed to do for you goes down. We have to talk about this. The light technician does not know what happens when green light touches black skin, for example. Makes us look like zombies. Yeah, so there are things, there are complications. Our skin predominantly likes both warm and cold light at the same time. In my company, I have Sudanese deep and lighter than me. To make people look like they're in the same room is actually quite a feat. And there's a lot of choreography going on that people do not know, where I even have to organize my dancers on stage according to color to make them look like they're in the same room. Because suddenly I can have somebody glow like Casper, and then another person completely disappear into obscurity. So it brings a certain need for competence even there. When we entered the opera, the music that we play, the sound technicians were not used to it. So then we actually had to ask for the guy who does rock festivals on his spare time, because he knew how to adjust the sound, and so on. So it's very interesting. We have to talk about that, not to mention what happens with the communication departments. And there's another thing. It's like, this happens to Tabanka all the time. We are blessed in a way. We knew long before we entered the so-called arts field that we needed to already have an audience. I always laugh when people say, oh, how come we don't see you in unconventional spaces and so on? And I'm like, how come you don't pay attention? Is what I want to answer, because we have been in the unconventional spaces for longer than anyone knows. That's why we entered the opera the first time we were there with more than 5,000 paying audiences. They didn't come from nowhere. We have met them everywhere that they are. So we're in unconventional spaces all the time. That's why we want to be on some of the conventional stages, to make sure that the audiences that we meet everywhere else can also feel comfortable in that space. And because our art also belongs there. But it's not some misconceptions of grandeur, or that, oh, we want to be where the white companies are because that's grander than where we already are. Because 90% of our time is spent in those other stages, so it's less than 10% of our endeavor. And that's actually where the balance is and out. But it's people only see you where they meet you, and they center themselves. Another thing we get all the time, which Asta touched upon, taste versus quality, and centering yourself. So, for example, in November last year, we had a show which was about how the black body had souled itself, meaning putting the soul back in the body that was attempted to be turned into an object. And the conversations with some audience members afterwards were interesting, because they, for example, said, oh, I noticed that you put some light moments in there. Didn't you think that we could handle more sadness? We could take it as a white audience. And then I have to answer them and say, well, we're actually dancing about a genocide that has specifically touched our families. Have you considered that the light moments might be there for us and the black audience that are there? And also, I asked them also, what was the black person next to you doing in that light moment? And that black person was crying, because we know at what cost did that laughter come. So for us, that's not a light moment. But for me, it was interesting, and it keeps being interesting, that there's an assumption that the only fully black dance company in this space would be making art that is somehow about white people. There's something in that of and it has taken me a long time to put words on where's my confusion coming from. It's like being mixed. Because I've always heard, oh, you're lucky because you're half Norwegian. And it took me, I had to have got off the phone with my Trinidad grandfather, and the Trinidadian language or Caribbean language is very specific. Like we say overstand instead of understand, because you wouldn't be under it, you would be on top of it, so you overstand. And that's when somebody said, oh, du jo heldig som halvt norsk. And then my Trini voice inside my head said, oh, so I'm half bad lucky? Like, what is this compliment? It's a very weird thing to say to somebody. So I just want to place that in the space and acknowledge there is something that happens with diversity and quality. And it's somebody's competence. And we need to actually talk about that.
Thank you. I'd like to throw out a question before I let the audience slippe til. Ask questions, because I'm sure you have questions and comments. I'd just like to ask if anyone has a response to this question. How do you look at diversity and the canon in your field?
And the what?
And the sort of, you have the canon of literature or the canon of dance. Could I just start with you, Phyllis, because it's a long time since we were with you.
So the canon of
dance. How do you feel about your work with dance and how it meets the Danish dance canon? The people who have the authority, who take up the space of this is what dance really is about.
Yeah. First of all, I don't exist. Secondly, I have no right to exist because I didn't attend Statens Scenekunstskole. To just share quickly my background, I started with ballet, jazz, contemporary, as well as hip-hop. I was allowed to be in the hip-hop space. I was not allowed in the same way to occupy the ballet space. I then later switched to a more folkloric style in a Scandinavian perspective, flamenco. So I spent the last 14 years in that. that in Spain is a conservatory thing as well. It's a very high level thing. But then trying to enter stages here, getting funding here for something that's super technical, super complicated, polyrhythmic, polycentric. It takes years and years and years of mastering this craft. Bear in mind, I had to learn a new language. I had to adapt to a new culture because I'm not appropriating. I am going into it. I've dedicated my body, my energy, my intelligence to that. To then come back and meet the Scandinavian institutions and the art scenes being like, but you're not educated. You're not schooled. We don't understand what you're doing. Thereby, we cannot fund you because we cannot box you. You're too contemporary for the folklore. You're too folkloric for the contemporary. And that actually happened recently and was verbalized because I confronted one of the power positions on why I was rejected in a piece that to me was critical for Danish art, for Danish dance as a reflection on the Danish society today. It was what I refer to as a third culture kid perspective, meaning I grew up in two cultures. I grew up in a Kenyan household, in Danish surroundings. I navigate both. I'm a cultural chameleon, and there are many of us here today. But because I'm not an expat kid who traveled around the world with a higher class of parents, being expat parents, sending me to international schools around the world, I'm not the good kind of third culture kid. I'm an immigrant kind of culture kid. And those stories apparently aren't that important. And the folkloric and the live music and the drumming and the beats in dance, the rhythm in dance, apparently isn't that important right now. It's more the philosophical approach that is important to movement, not the actual physical need to move. And so my piece worked on that. It worked on my own identity. I am Danish, I'm Kenyan, and I'm a flamenco dancer. And I'm investigating my roots, because what happens when you have roots somewhere, but your crown is swaying in another place? That disconnect. How do we find a true identity when everyone is trying to box us into one category and we never fit any of them? And we keep breaking them and they keep putting us into new ones. I got 0 funding. 0. I got none of the cultural elite to come and see and write about my works. But what I did get was a diverse audience. What I did get was comments from people who looked like me, and even people who didn't look like me, but who also couldn't be boxed in the same way when it came to cultural and ethnic identity. And it resonated with them. And it continues to do that traveling around outside of Denmark. But my kind of dance, my canon of dance, is not the real one. And therefore, I'm not important. I don't know the right people. I didn't attend the right schools. I wasn't indoctrinated in the right cultural way. My body doesn't move in the right cultural way, although it can, but I choose not to. But therefore, I am othered, and therefore I don't exist, and therefore I don't get funding. And so to speak on the canon and the quality, it is ridiculous that we even talk about what is quality, and that we have the same group of people defining what is quality in performing arts. That's my field, so that's what I can speak on. And it's ridiculous that they also at the same time talk about the necessity of diversifying the audience, where, as I think most of us of color know, that it's all about mirroring and representation. So the second I'm telling a story from my narrative, but that is not a monotonous, homogeneous narrative, I speak to people that the contemporary Danish dancers from Dansk Scenekunstskole with a philosophical approach to Mars might not. But they get to be on the stages with the funding and shake the hands of the so-called right people and keep producing the same works as everyone else, and I keep being invisible. But I also still keep getting the most diverse audience members, and no one is asking me. Why? They're asking their fellows, why don't we get the people from the suburbs or the urban people to come and see our contemporary dance?
We have half an hour left, and I'd like to ask if we just keep it short, the rest of the panel. Do you all want to speak, or just a little bit?
I'm not very good at speaking short, but you help me really well.
I can give you a nudge when it's
because I think one of those things that I found interesting researching this field of diversity within the arts that I found is to realize that a lot of what's in the canon of Western art and literature is actually being produced coming in from diverse backgrounds. Alexandre Dumas was a mixed race French. And when I heard that, I clicked in and understood his stories in a very different way, especially that that's a lot of the banter as well, actually. That makes a lot more sense as well. And, if you go further back in history as well, I mean, I'm not sure if you will count Turkish nomad tribe as being part of diversity. Depends how you count these things. But Leonardo da Vinci would be lost if you didn't, if you took away that contribution. There's a lot of diversity that's been part of the production of art always, but it has not been acknowledged as such in the distribution part of it. It's always as if it's been like, in order to, place it on the top of the shelf, it has been stripped of its background. And I think one of the most, there's many examples of it, but one of them also being Charlie Chaplin, who was born in a gypsy camp in West Midlands. And when you know that he was a gypsy, or a Romani, as we say now, that his films becomes more real. You understand his stories a lot more, and you understand what they're about. So I think that, in terms of production, it's always been there, but it has been failed to be recognised and understood as what it is. I think that's actually the greatest push that we have in front of us to do that, to do that work.
Make it clear, yeah.
Yeah.
Thomas?
Yeah. I think it's, again, to acknowledge also what Phyllis said before and what has been mentioned several times before today. In these conversations, there's something that happens once blackness enters the equation as well. Because in this dialogue about thinking is now important in dance versus the doing and the body and so on, once that happens and a black body enters that conversation, the entire conversation actually shifts and it becomes a story about the savage. Where we, the Westerners, we think great thoughts and we are more civilized while you do what you do on the basis of instinct and culture. Even if that was not your intention, that is actually the forces that come into play, and that becomes part of the narrative. And what is also then so hard is that if you point that out, what you meet is, I'm not a racist, you just called us racist, da da da, and you meet this fragility, which is absolutely irrelevant to the conversation actually. On an interpersonal level, of course there's empathy and understanding of it. At the same time, I had to say, after living in the bodies that we do, there's a limit to how much empathy we can have for every time somebody is surprised that we're not in a post-racial society. I will also say there is a limit. And like Kamara so eloquently said this morning, it hurts, it's painful. But having now gone and done the correct thing, and Ella, you're a big thing of that because your voice is wrong in my head, because every time I talk to you, even if it's not so often, she keeps asking me about my education. So then I went and I did a master's. That was very interesting on many levels. I was told at multiple times that I was going to be given Western references because naturally I couldn't have them or something like that because of how I look. My great-grandmother is Borghild Ruud, who illustrated Teatersalen. I grew up in Prøysen, rented from her, but she's a woman, so you won't hear that. She also wrote most of Teatersalen and a lot of his Lørdagsstubber, but she's a woman, so you won't hear that. So I'm just also pointing that in, that I acknowledge other invisibilities. But also something happened, again with the same performance, because now that I have gone to this KIO, this institution, people say, oh, the quality of your work really raised. And that makes me really sad, because KIO was not in that work at all. Because I was doing a full master's and doing a production, I've never had as little time to do a production ever as I had then. The difference that people were seeing in the work was the fact that that was the first performance where I had gotten support from the Arts Council prior to the performance itself. So what you were seeing was money.
Yeah.
And we also have to talk about that money is part of this quality thing. Because a lot of the times we see money and then we say we're seeing quality. Not necessarily so. The costumes was more expensive. For the first time also we had an entire week to do lights and stuff. So lights was of course a lot better. Normally we have 2 days. The next time we're going to be on the same stage, we're going to have 2 days. But the light is still going to be fantastic. Because I have a real quality in how good looking my dancers are. So that will still work. But what I'm trying to point out is that we really need to start to be honest about what are we talking about when we're talking about this quality thing. And are we also just looking for ourselves? Because the only difference between me going to KIO and not going to KIO is that other people can now claim me and claim the work in a way that they couldn't before. And therefore, because they can now imagine themselves in it, the quality is supposedly better. Because you are meeting now a lot of the people that are my mentors. I have always had access to the institution, and I've had access to people who are way more knowledgeable about the particular genre that I'm in than who are in the institutions here in Norway. I have to point that out. As much as I respect the people who are in those institutions for what they've done. So my comment is not meant as a disrespect to them. It's just meant as a contextualization.
I'd like to ask you on this, I don't know if you'd relate to the canon or more to, there's this question about bringing in something new, whether that's innovative, whether diversity brings on authenticity, innovation. Could you just say a few words about that before we carry on?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood your question, so I'll just answer the last one, if it's okay. Because speaking about canon and diversity, I think that's a contradiction in terms, actually, because the very idea of a canon is to fix something that we can hold on to. So it's a tool. Canon is all about power of defining. When you define the canon, then you define whatever expressions that are going to be the symbol of that, of the body that's defining it. So just that about the canon. That
does it have to be fixed though? Does it? I mean, because
a fluid canon is
a modern canon. Can't a modern canon be more fluid?
As I understand the term of canon, the very idea is to fix something, so a fluid canon. It sounds beautiful. I'm not sure that
it doesn't exist.
It's possible. Then it will be something else, probably something better. I have to say that the symbolic importance of having a more diverse canon is very important. So I would prefer a canon that is more diverse and that includes more different expressions that are very monocultural canon. But sadly, most of the canons that we know are very monocultural. So yeah.
I would argue that the institutions of learning can try through the curriculum to expand that.
They should, but and it should be that way. I'm just saying how I feel it is. So I perfectly agree. It should be.
Sure. I think the time has come to Meena. We'll have to.
I'll say something very shortly,
Yeah?
because I actually do know how to talk very shortly. It's a flaw I have. It's a flaw I have. No, but I think that we do need to talk about things that need to be fixed, because I feel that, at least in the film world, the diverse stories that we are telling are diversity stories that white people in Norway want to hear, because then they can pat themselves on the back and say, oh, that's exactly how I thought it was in that culture. So we do need to fix that with a huge cannon and just boom.
Yeah.
All right, over to the audience. There's a question over there.
Actually, it's a reflection of what you've been talking about and also what I've heard today. And I want to ask a question, because I asked the last panel. How many of you receive money from the government to do what you do? None of you?
No, ever or regularly, or what's the?
No, yeah, regularly.
Once.
No,
film
I
that's
mean,
on
how
TV.
many of you have funding from the government?
I have funding. Well, we have funding from the
You have?
Yeah.
Okay.
Project based.
You have funding. Do you represent me?
Am I representing you?
Yeah.
It depends what you mean by that.
No, why I'm asking is, when we speak about power, when we speak about quality and diversity, money moves things. So
Yeah.
that's why I always wonder, if you have the money and you want diversity,
Yeah.
are you representing me? Yeah, I know. I will give you more
That's
questions.
a way more complicated question that it comes out as.
It is actually.
It's like,
Let me tell you why I ask it. It's part of a program. I represent a organization in Sweden for members of the cultural sector with the roots in the African diaspora.
Yeah.
And we were asked for the 2-year mark of Me Too, that now focus on mångfald, to diversity, to come up with a lathund. What we did was come up with 5 questions for people in power to ask themselves where the money goes. Because if you want diversity, I mean, the numbers you said, I think most of those percents are in the room. So it is the elephant in the room, is that we're not talking about racism, we're not talking about history, we're not talking about the fact that a lot of knowledge is needed in order to create diversity. And if we, is there, I think it's too early even to say, is it going to be more diversity or quality, the one against the other? Of course, like Thomas says, we need to get into schools. If we can't get into schools, and all of a sudden you say maybe it's a concept of quality. Well, we didn't get into the schools, so we didn't learn. And if we did, we didn't get the jobs, and the stories being told is about you through your eyes. But I was not going to say that. What I was going to say is tell a little story. After a show I did in Sweden with the Raisin in the Sun, fantastic play. And we had a discussion with students afterwards, and the students asked me why black actors only want to play slaves or gangsters.
Sorry.
That was a real question. So where do we put that? Where do we start changing things, and how is art going to survive keeping a level of quality without diversity? There's a big gap here. Very big gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure how. Do you want me to respond to what you said?
No. It's a rhetorical question.
I'm just
I asked it
on
on
the receiving end of
But
it.
if you can,
Yeah.
you can. Of course, you can answer it. But it's more to ask within yourself, in order to do the work that diversity needs you to do, in order to get it in your organization, in the panels, making the budgets and everything. You need to ask yourself, what do I do to contribute to a more diverse society? How does it reflect through my art? What do I teach others?
Yeah.
How do I make sure that the person in this room that represents, that carries diversity is feeling safe enough to just do what they're there for.
The reason why I'm holding back is that I find it hard to answer that question without standing there like sort of a bit sort of like bragging about my efforts. I mean, it's like, I don't know, if you ask me how I represent you, I would say that I represent a group of artists and producers who do make, you know, really good works that shows the diversity of what Norway is about. And if you feel part of that, then yeah, we naturally represent you. But if you talk about something more specific, and I think that one of the reasons why I got like a bit sort of like, how do you represent me as almost like a taxpayer? I'm like not sure how to respond to that part of it.
I'm asking it because the government gives you money and says they have a responsibility to be diverse, but we're not really seeing it. And also, I mean them too. I mean, can I see myself in Norway? Would I be able to see myself in Norway now in films? In TV?
You were the one.
Yeah?
You were the one. We can say, because you
person.
haven't introduced yourself, but you were the only black person
Really?
that was
Still?
Norwegian on TV, or you're not even
Still?
Norwegian, you're Swedish, but you were the only black person on Norwegian TV when we all grew up. You are the one, and after you, you have not been replaced.
There's nobody.
I'd like to open the floor to some other comments as well. Yep.
We miss you. Come back.
Get a few more questions and then we'll do a round in the panel.
No, it was, yeah, again, I have actually never really received money from the government, but I recently shifted my thought when it comes to this power perspective and representation and distributing of funds, where I've spent a good 10 years trying to knock down doors and having them slammed back in my face, trying to get a seat at the table. And although it doesn't fix anything short term, I have decided that I no longer want a seat at the table. I want to create my own table. Because I can't speak for the rest of Scandinavia, but I would say that Denmark is quite far behind, even in a Nordic context. And I, and many like me, are very exhausted from trying. But the thing is, we're on a ship and it's sinking. And we are the people who can survive, right? We are the future. They will need us. They don't know yet that they need us. One day they will realize, and probably quite soon, and then they will come and ask for a seat at our table. And I'm just letting you know this will happen. It will happen. Because as long as we continue like this will happen, and the table will be full of BIPOCs. And our stories, the way we want to tell them.
There's another comment from the audience.
Hi, my cynical mind gets a little confused with the subjects, the topics. So, because my mind is processing it that it's not as mysterious or as complex as we are presenting. Because the work of artists of multicultural background, etc. Because if that same artwork is presented by a white, acceptable face, then it goes to another level of amazingness. But that same work, if it's presented by the people we're talking about here, then it's a little bit of an issue. It takes you have to step back, the powers that be have to step back and think, are we ready for this? Will this not cause confusion? I mean, what about the money? And what about the audience? Suddenly, so many boxes that cannot be ticked materialize. So my question is, my cynical mind, curiosity says, is it the messenger or is it the actual work in itself? I like to think that it's the messenger. I have a small example. Going way back, I wrote a great essay at university. I got a certain grade. A friend, white friend, the next year needed to package, was doing the same course, but did not have the time. We swapped the essay. That same friend, in the right frame, got an A+ for that same essay that got a B++ previous year. Same teachers, same topic. So when I spin that and put it into art and into everything else, it could also be in law as well, where there's a crime committed by X and the same crime committed by Y. I'm just saying that, is it really that difficult, this whole business of quality, diversity, or is it the vehicle that's bringing that work? I mean, is what I'm saying complicated?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that causes me a problem, and that makes me think that there's some pretentiousness about all this, educate us, enlighten us. Because there's no enlightenment when the right face present that same primitive work.
Yeah. I don't only have one example, I have 100 examples of that. And it is remarkable the way it's actually often been, like for instance, Surrealism did that. Surrealism, there are a lot of Surrealist painters. There was a time in Paris 100 years back when the post-colonial, well, the need to be post-colonial began. There was a lot of independent movements represented in Paris, and there was a really vibrant African visual art scene, and there was a lot of Surrealists being inspired by it. But that art that they were inspired by is less acknowledged than the art that it inspired. And I think that's just one of many. That's quite a famous example, but I've come across that a lot of things, and it's sort of like, it becomes detective work. We need to rewrite, actually, the history of our culture. And it's also, and interestingly enough, there were Surrealists, researchers, actually involved in doing that, but then they got themselves killed in the Second World War, because that was just sort of that sort of really vulnerable time. But there is interesting sort of precedence of that attempt of rewriting the history of European art and then doing that, trying to establish a more equality between the cultures.
There's a short comment from Thomas, and then the next person in the audience.
Okay, then if it's short, it's going to sound even harsher, but I've been told and I've been comfortable with having to be the voodoo doll, so I will probably be stabbed for this, and that's fine. It is not that complicated, and we have to talk about representation. Tabanka, my company, a lot of people here who only come to see us at the opera and so on will know the 12, 13 professional dancers. We have 268 members. We make sure that we represent broader than that. Oslo Urbane Hip Hop Club has 1,700 members. I'm comparing it, Noda has around 900 and something. So it's a little under 1,000, just to comparison. And I'm not comparing it directly, but I'm just mentioning it because in some settings, we talk democracy, representation, it is important and it releases funding. In other contexts, it absolutely doesn't matter. If you go to IMDi and you look at big immigrant organizations in Norway, almost none of the ones you will see there are democratic organizations that have members, and most of them are even white organizations that speak on behalf of black people. Kulturradet and some others have done the same. Now in the arts field, there's a discussion on whether a group is a national competence center for folk dancing. Some people reacted to that. I will say I react that some places are now being called competence centers on interculture and so on, because I want to know what's the process around. And I'm not saying, I'm not challenging, they might be. That's not my grievance. My grievance is, what was the process around it? Who decided that they were? By what criteria were they? And do we now have situations where the Arts Council can meet with somebody who has this title, where actually nobody has members, nobody has a democratic process, and there might not even be a BIPOC person in the room when BIPOC people are being discussed, but everyone is happy because we've ticked the boxes of representation because we talked to somebody who knows. I'm sorry, we have to be able to lift this discussion up and have them be unpopular, because it's not about liking, not liking, and so on. It's about, are we being represented? We like to say in Norway that we have this democratic process and we're super good at frivillighet and all of those things, and I'm sorry, we're not. We really are not, because we are very selective of when it counts and when it does not count. As short as I can get it.
Can I just say one comment to you? With the example you gave, to me that sounds very much like cultural appropriation. And I think that it's important that we also talk about that, because inspiration, if you don't acknowledge where the inspiration came from, if you don't highlight and visualize the people who so-called inspired you, you just take it and then you get the spotlight and the fame. That is appropriation, and we need to address that too, because it's happening a lot still today. It's happening a lot where people get inspired by the savages, the others, the whatever, Africans, Asians, Latinos, but where are they? They're not visible, but we're making money off it.
But the surrealists themselves acknowledge this, but it is
But where is it in the history books?
Yeah, but
we're written out of absolutely everything all the time.
This is my problem about this discussion about cultural appropriation, is that often the appropriation bit is done in the writing of the history, not in the production of the art itself.
And this is not a critique of you. It's just that highlight it.
I kind of sit here with this feeling. No, I mean there are examples of both, Thomas. There are, and there's not
way more examples of one than the other, because we have to acknowledge that during colonialism and the power difference, it's the same as saying that the relationship between the slave master and the slave was a willing relationship where there was an equal power balance and it was 100% her choice. We cannot do those things. We can't sanitize the history in that way, but it's a completely different discussion, so we can continue at another place.
Actually, it might not be. This discussion that we have in terms of quality versus diversity is actually one of those things that it's a question that's been buried underneath in our history. And talking of just using the surrealists as an example, it's like an example of a history gone wrong. It started out as something else than what it became. The surrealists themselves were really genuinely, they really appreciated African art. I have this feeling that I've chickened out on a challenge that you gave me, and I'm not sure if I have time to answer it back. But what I want to say is that in terms of representation, I so 100% agree with you. And what I did at one point was to reorganize our staff. And what I did was, it was a really painful process where I also took away, I know that this is the, because I was warned against talking about the specifics of that process, but it was really important to reorganize how the staff makes decisions. And placing people with a diversity background into the decision-making process there's no way around it. If you're going to really release the quality in our cultural field, there's just no way around that. So, and I've done that, and I've walked through the confusion that arose from it. So anyone who wants to talk to me from an institutional leader point, I will be your support. And absolutely, and you will be rewarded. And everyone now in the organisation sits really happily with that change that it produced, because we were right. It became better. So yeah.
And
then three people.
I just want to say briefly, I think part of the point of calling this diversity versus quality is to show how absurd that is. I mean, it's not something you can take it seriously. That's why we're sitting here.
Yeah.
I work in the film business. I wouldn't say that every single movie that's been made by a white man with a receding hairline is brilliant. Far from, actually, you know. Like so that is what we're talking about. And to the lady upstairs who was talking about whether it's the message or the messenger, I would say that it is both. And the problem that we have is that right now, unfortunately, power and money is situated with the predominantly white majority. And they want the messages packed in a way that they recognize it. And they recognize it the way they read about it in the media.
Yeah.
And that is why it is the message and the messenger.
Yeah. All right. Audience questions. Where's the microphone? It's there, and then it'll go up there, and then it'll go. And we have all of 9 minutes left. So.
Hello.
4 minutes.
My name is Ali. I'm a filmmaker. I just want to share an idea with all of you here, because when it comes to representation, I think for all the institutions and also for the artists and the people that are activists, it will help a lot that we integrate transparency into the systems. And with that, I think about the criteria of quality and diversity, but also how we measure it. So that next time we have a discussion like this, we can say that we have measured it. We now actually know. It's not a feeling. It's not something I feel, but I actually know that by the measurements and by the ways of transparency, we can actually say that we have reached certain goals. Otherwise, we can continue with this reflection and ongoing resonance of intellectual discussions, but we actually need to be transparent about where the power is, how the power is distributed in the means of money and resources.
Next question or comment. That was a very good comment.
Yeah, it was.
On the question of issue of canons, this is just an observation. I'm in the literature department, so recently I had a meeting with the head of English at one of your Scandinavian countries, and the gentleman complained vehemently about, because you see, when people are in a safe space with safe, diverse people, then there's another discussion that takes place. And of course, you then have the choice of how you're going to respond to that. But often it's not bad to be silent. But regarding the canon, the gentleman complained that, can you imagine that they've now brought in one of the books of the Nigerian lady who wrote Half of the Yellow Sun. That, can you imagine that I have been asked to teach that, and they've taken away X and replaced it with that. I mean, what are they thinking? What's the word coming to? So with this issue of canon, and I asked, well, who was responsible? He said the powers that be. They said, this is what I should now teach.
The Illuminati or what?
Sorry?
The Illuminati, or who are they?
So I'm saying that even when we do have new work going into the canon, first of all, they only go in under a certain acceptable frame. So the guy said, well, this only makes sense because immigrant literature. So that in itself is already he's really saying it's not really a canon, but we have to pretend that it's in it, and I'm being forced to teach it. So where do we really stop all this peddling? Because it's just happening at so many levels. And so what should be properly in the canon is being derided by the very person who's supposed to teach it. So once again, in my mind, when that conversation was taking place, I was thinking, well, I wonder how he will actually, I wonder how he's been teaching it. Because then he has to go into pretend mode as well and give it all the significance of Shakespeare and all the others, which for him is the real deal. So where do we begin to sort this problem out? Because it's very subjective and it sits in the head. So this kind of conversation doesn't even go close to it, because we're also very good at pretending when we're not in safe spots.
Yeah, we are polite.
There's one last comment, I think, at the end, and we'll... is there one more?
there.
Over there?
Second.
I'll try to be short. My name again is Jakob Seyse. I'm a writer. My question goes to Thomas and Phyllis. This is perhaps a silly question, but I'll try. It takes a hell of a time to put up a production. It takes a lot of thinking, a lot of hard work. And when you turn to the institution for support, with all this work and all this, getting this thing back, please, Thomas, you have how many dancers? Sorry.
15 at the moment.
15 at the moment. How does it take all this phone calls, all these preparations? I know this is a big question, but I want you to say
and I can answer it with numbers.
A few words about this, please.
I can answer it, and I can answer it with numbers. What we have to also mention here, which we don't, is that people will bring their child into ballet class at 4-year-old, and that ballet class is partly subsidized. They will continue in that class, and then they will go on to a free education for 3 years at gymnasiet videregående. And there, if they're lucky, they will go on to a free education of higher learning at KIO or the National Arts Council and so on. And then they will go into subsidized dance productions. We've done some of the numbers. Between 800,000 and 1.5 million, the usual dancer who would enter a scenic stage in Norway represents in just subsidy to stand on the stage. I have had to set up an entire art cycle from year 4 all the way to professionalization, and I am carrying the brunt of the entire thing. That costs about 3 to 4 million. And that's only because there's so many people like you and people who are sitting here. Mercy, who heads the Association of Dance of the African Diaspora, she knows us for the technique and so on. She knows that these dancers travel internationally and are represented to be at the top of the world when it comes to technique within African dance and so on. And these are trained completely outside of the institution here. Dancers, I have no dancers that have been with me for less than 5 years. The dancer that has been with me the longest has been with me 17 years and has worked their ass off to produce an environment that can free other dancers to also perform. So it does not take us 2 months. It does not take us 3 months. It takes us 17 years. And that's why we're the only company in the Nordics, because there's no places to train them even in order to do it, and then have to tick all the invisible boxes to make sure to prove that they are professionals so that they can release funds. And that has been a hell of a thing. I've had to write an entire curriculum for NTNU, unpaid, 500 pages, in order to validate some of the dancers, and to be able to say that 3 modules of our technique is the equivalent of 60 study points. And therefore we can say, so it has been a production of size where there are multiple people who have fed in, entire communities that have fed into the process of being able to put up one production that we have done. Because there are entire communities and the entire government is in a contemporary art piece here, is in the ballet dance piece here. We don't acknowledge that it's not the choreographer that did it, because the choreographer can hold an audition with people who are already trained, because there's a community of dance teachers that have fed in to the artistry of the young people that are standing in it. The same opportunity has to be given to Indian dance, to African dance, to new styles we don't even know of yet because they haven't existed, and so on. So it really takes a lot of work. And that, to me, is the real elephant in the room. Because we can pretend that it's only about letting 1 or 2 people into the institution and then somehow it will magically be solved. There are creative hubs. Nico and Vince, Mad Con, all of these people, Maria that is sitting there, Samsaya that is sitting there, and so on. People here that are in the art fields, do you know anything about the cultural hubs that produce those talents, that have represented Norway internationally? The answer is no. And that's why we're so hard to reach. But there are cultural hubs that are producing real talent of quality that travels out of Norway every day. And they are not funded by the Norwegian government.
Thank you. I think we're coming towards the end of this discussion, and we are on overtime already. We're 5 minutes over, and I don't know who's taking over the room after us. Is
Nobody.
There something? Nobody?
Hey!
There's a summary.
I thought we could just sit till the cars come home.
So I think I'm afraid I think we have to finish if there's a summary coming up after us. Thank you all for participating very actively in this discussion. And I'd like to thank the panel. So we have to go up? It's being streamed.